What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Cooper Stuff. I'm all pumped up. I got an awesome guest today. A lot of people are going to know who this is, and I've read his new book. It's fantastic. Say hello to Brian Kilmeade. Brian, say hello to the Cooper Stuff fans.
Well, thanks everyone for watching, and John, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. You'll be on my radio show shortly, I hope.
Yeah, that's right. This is a weird one with me interviewing you. Okay, we've only got 20 minutes. I want to jump straight into this, but before I do, I just need to say for anybody who doesn't know, you are the busiest man in the entertainment business. I mean, because I've been following you for years. You're mainly known for Fox and Friends, host in the morning. You have a radio show. You've written like 5,000 books. I love your history show that you do on Fox Nation. You are busy, man.
Yeah, it's a fun job. I mean, with the pandemic, it really cut out a lot of the remote stuff, but we still did it. So I have two more coming out on what made America great, because I try to focus on stuff about our past. It doesn't get a lot of traction. Went to Ellis Island before it opened, 5:30 in the morning. Had to miss Fox and Friends one day, and just went through that incredible history. And then we have another one coming out next week as well, and that is what Teddy Roosevelt was able to do as 2.5 years as police commissioner in New York, in terms of help getting life better for first generation immigrants. They were being taken advantage of. They were being left in slums. The cops were just all Irish. If you weren't Irish, you couldn't be a cop. They're drinking on the job. Everyone had different type of guns. He came in and gave these first generation immigrants rights and straightened out the cops. He even had Ray Kelly on this one, because his desk is still used by police commissioners today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
so it's fair to say from following you for a long time that you do all these things, but it seems to me that your true passion is history. Is that accurate enough?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I started as a sports guy. First job at Sports Phone, worked at a TV network, did all sports radio out in California. I had a chance to do a lot of different things. But every time I wanted to get away and do something, it would always be about history. And also, I think that history helps you with news, to know that history didn't start yesterday. You can't judge news as if it's just happening now. It always helps me to put it in perspective. So whether you're talking about the United Nations or World War, we're talking about race relations. This is bad. George Floyd was a bad scene. Okay, but what is the truth about it? What was the situation with segregation? What did happen leading to the Civil War? What was it about? What did Lincoln think? So, what was TR thinking? Why did he have a relationship with Booker T. Washington? Why was some of the Black community upset by that? So when people start talking to you about what's happening now, you go, well, this is not the first time we've been down here, or it is the first time we've been down here.
Absolutely. Very, very smart. And now that's a perfect segue into the book. For everybody who wants to see it, this is what it looks like. I love the cover as well, but the book is great. It is called The President and the Freedom Fighter. Now, before I ask you questions about it, I do want to brag on it. It is so easy to read.
Thank you.
And I am assuming that, being that you've done TV for so long, is probably how you learn to tell a story without telling insignificant part. You get straight to it. So you're not reading 1,000 pages of history. You're reading what's important. Is that have anything to do with it?
I think you're 100% right. And that's very insightful. What I try to do, the first thing I do is I sit down with the editor, and I'll do the research, make my presentation. They'll have their own ideas, but then I'll talk through the whole book, and we'll record the whole thing. And they'll come back, they'll bounce it off, and they'll say, these are the elements that we think we should bring out. It's a give and take. But the first thing I do is talk the whole book through. And also, the one thing about Fox, they teach you to get to the point. Be active and get to the point. My hope is, I have no interest, nor am I capable of writing for the Harvard professor. They write for themselves anyway. I'm going to a bunch of guys and women of all different ages. They care about the country, want to know a little bit more, but I want to whet their appetite. So if you read this book and say, man, I got to learn more about Lincoln, great. You say, well, I want Douglas's whole life. What happened afterwards? That's David Blight's book that Barack Obama just bought the rights to, about Frederick Douglass. Go ahead, do it. And my hope is to set you up and to know that it's 100% accurate. And the one thing that helps is that Frederick Douglass wrote his autobiography 7 years after escaping to freedom, and then updated 3 times. So I know exactly what he thought. I'm not projecting what I thought. I know exactly his frustrations. And then, sometimes you need an outsider to judge our lives. I get it. So I read all that stuff. But to get that, and then Lincoln wrote so many letters and speeches. I read every one of Lincoln's speeches, every letter I can get a hold of. Obviously, didn't have a chance to write his autobiography, but so many other people that knew him did write about him.
Mm. I'm going to get you to. I really want to talk to you about the contemporary significance of that, like what is poignant for today. But before we do, we should give people an insight about what the book is. But one more brown nosing statement that I'll make, and then I'll be done. Sometimes when you write a song, like the biggest song that I ever wrote, there was an element of the song that people said, how come this hasn't been said before? It seemed obvious. And that's part of what made it a really great song, right? Because you're hitting it. That's when I was reading this book, I was thinking, how come there hasn't been a book like this where you have Lincoln, you have Douglas at the same time, when you can see this is what he was going through, this is what he was going through, and how it connects. It just feels like, I can't believe this hasn't been done. It's such an insightful way to look at it. So you tell me anything you want to tell fans about it so they can go out and buy the book.
What I wanted to do is number one, I like self-made stories. So these are both self-made men, and they talked about the need to do that. Now, obviously, born a slave, no one could come from more dire circumstances. So he never knew his mother, father, or his birthday. He knew his mother, excuse me. He claims to have. His mom came to him twice in the middle of the night. Biographers have said, we don't know if that's true or not, but she came to him, and he had no family. But he was determined to make something of himself. So at the fundamental level, at the very least, if you don't love American history, but you're looking for inspiration in your life, especially in the pandemic when everyone's life just had to grind to a halt, especially performers like you, all of a sudden there's no crowds, there's no tickets to sell, there's music to write, but it's solemn. So you want something to inspire you. How about Abraham Lincoln? I mean, the guy, people talked about what an odd looking guy he was his whole life. His dad was borderline abusive. His mom died when he was 9. His stepmom stepped up in the middle of nowhere, working with his hands every minute of the day, but every free moment, he was trying to read and write. He had 1 year combined of formal schooling. Now, people reading the book will say, my life's terrible. I had an abusive father. My mom was an alcoholic. I was adopted by parents who were indifferent towards me. You're 100% right. I'm not saying your life's easy, but you need inspiration to show you that anything is possible. And I thought that's what a lot of people got out of Jackson. People like, Jackson was crazy, and I don't like the way he treated American Indians. But my goodness, he was orphaned at the age of 10 years old. He already fought in a war, was already imprisoned. And next thing you know, he finds himself a lawyer, a senator, and a 2-term president while being a war hero without any really formal education. That should inspire you, and also inspire you that you're an American. Because in America at that time, and I think to a degree today, is the only society where it's a meritocracy to a degree, to almost an nth degree. If you're good, or you are good, if you have some talent and are willing to work, you're going to be successful on some level. And if you're not getting it from your parents and your brothers and your uncles, if you're not getting it from your teachers and your coaches, get it from the books, and just make that your personal coach, your Anthony Robbins, your Zig Ziglar.
Absolutely. I think sometimes people maybe like yourself, like me, we get pinned in this box of conservatism with whitewashed history, and America is awesome, and we're not willing to look back on anything bad that's happened. That is absolutely not fair, but it certainly is not like that in the book. You tell the real history. You talk about how Lincoln shifted on his views. It's not whitewashed. Do you want to say anything about Lincoln and how his views shifted?
Well, put it this way, he was not from a slave family. He did not have slavery. There wasn't a lot of it around him. Keep in mind, I think like 7% of all the slaves were in the North. Almost all of them were in the South. And it was almost with communication the way it was back then. You could live your life and not really encounter many African Americans in the North, but you might have what we would look at as racist views now, because you were born into a society where education was among the whites, and you saw African Americans who didn't have it and think they weren't smart, which is something on a different degree we think today. There weren't opportunities there. Frederick Douglass bucks that. He was determined. He knew education was freedom. And what's so interesting, John, is at the same time, I'm looking and covering critical race theory. And then what you learn in school, especially at a young age, and at the same time, I'm going back in history, trying to figure out, what was going on back then. Lincoln knew it. Lincoln's goal after the Civil War was to flood the South with housing and teachers. And they were like, here, you can't get anywhere without an education. And also, when you're young, you can get everywhere with education. And what we find, and Frederick Douglass actually says in his book, that kids don't see color. And it's a shame that until they get older, they see color. At the same time, I'm reading about critical race theory and the 1619 Project and them jamming it down first graders' throats. And I'm saying they're making these kids see color when they don't see it. So Frederick Douglass in a slave society was saying his friends were white. They looked at him as no different. He's on the docks talking to other white kids and says, it's probably going to be a generation. We got to wait for this next generation before everyone realizes all races are equal. My goodness, how optimistic, because that was 1850. That's how hopeful they were. But there was segregation, there was slavery, no doubt about it. You have people, the smartest people in the world, who thought, well, blacks and whites, they should be free, but they know they're not equal. Lincoln said that early. But I would argue by the time he's running for his second term, he's basically running like an abolitionist. And the more he gets exposed to the black culture, the more he realizes there is no difference. And then at the same time, I'm looking at another abolitionist, another guy, maybe the smartest man to ever to walk the earth, is Benjamin Franklin. If you think about what he did, he had slaves. But by the time he gets older, he realizes, man, it's all about education. I'm an abolitionist. So should we hate Benjamin Franklin? No, he evolved. And he became, at the end, he saw kids, black and white kids in class, and go, man, they're just as smart. They need this opportunity. Lincoln was working his way there too, 50 years later. And, Washington and Jefferson, I have them in the intro. They talk about, they know the evils of slavery. They did not know how to get out of it. They were born into this culture, did not know how to get out of it. And it was easier in the North to be Alexander Hamilton when you're living in an urban environment to do that than it was the South. Not to make excuses, not that Alexander Hamilton would have felt any different or John Adams would have felt any more different, being anti-slavery, and John Quincy Adams especially back then. But I'm just saying, you're not born with it, you're not born into it. When that's not the engine of your personal economy, it's easy to turn the page. But they knew the evils of it. They wanted to get rid of it, but it was happening. And everyone should watch right now. It was happening on every continent.
Well, another contemporary thing that I think is what you just said. People always want to be binary about everything, and people get extreme. You're either pro CRT or you are anti CRT. Nobody's willing to have these issues. And then one of the things I liked in the book was how it explained how even amongst abolitionists, there was not agreement on what to do. Some people said we got to end slavery and we must, send them to Liberia. And everybody had these different ideas. And I think there's a contemporary correlation there that we always want to polarize everybody and say, well, if you don't agree with A, then you must be a racist, or if you don't agree with B, then you are whatever. When in reality, what we need are some open conversations. Yeah. And I think that shows between the abolitionists and the book. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I did a half-hour special, an hour special on the book. And one of the people I interviewed in the South, in South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union, was, and where Fort Sumter is, obviously, where the first battle took place in the Civil War, with Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham, a black guy and a white guy. So a black guy brought him up. He brought me to his home. It was totally impoverished. You could not be poorer and have a home than Tim Scott, whose dad and mom divorced at a young age when he was 9, and he ended up living with his grandparents in basically one room in South Carolina. And I asked him, did you ever go down? I've forgotten. It's their version of Main Street. I forgot which name it was because I'm not from South Carolina. He goes, Brian, we never came down here when we were younger, because he's about 57, 58. But I come here now and I'm looking around. It's black and white. It looks equal. I walk into restaurants. It's equal. Lindsey Graham told me, when they taught him about history, they said it was a war of northern aggression. So there needed to be some updating
Wow.
in the South on the Civil War. I get it. But in Long Island, in New York, I learned all the evils of slavery. I didn't learn that white people were evil. I didn't learn that black people were subhuman. I learned what they were living through back then, the evils of slavery. I'm older than you, John, but I read this as most famous miniseries ever is Roots, where they talked about the slave trade in the most evil way, in the most accurate way you could imagine, Alex Haley's book. And we learned that we were getting quizzes on that. So for people like who do the 1619 project and say, you white middle class, by the way, I was lucky to be middle class, probably lower middle class, if not lower. You white middle class people don't have any idea what it's like being black, or you don't understand real history. I'm like, really? I learned real history. I don't know what it's like to live it. I can't be you, but you can't accuse us of not learning the unvarnished history. If there were nuances in depth to it, let's do it. But if you want to tell me that I'm evil, you want to tell me that America is built on stolen land through the economic engine of slavery, it's just flat out inaccurate.
Mm. You know, I loved it in the book how you talk about how Douglas kept fighting for there to be black soldiers. What is it that what one troop of black soldiers would be worth twice white soldiers? I thought that was really inspiring and exciting. The book doesn't whitewash any of this. It just gives you the details that you want to know. And I love that. One other thing I learned, am I right in understanding that Lincoln did not win the popular vote?
Not close. In fact, if the Democrats didn't divide their vote, he didn't get one electoral vote from the South. Can you imagine that? He got about 40% of the vote. Stephen Douglas thought he was going to the guy that he beat for the Senate, not Frederick, that beat him for the Senate. But his speeches and the debates were so substantive, he ends up being this brand new party called the Republican Party's first nominee. And Douglas was this political animal who was pro-slavery. But the Democrats divided the vote, allowing these Republicans to step forward, and he got no votes at all from the South. So by the time he gets to the White House, we now know it's the White House under Teddy Roosevelt. But now, again, times the executive building, half the country had left. 7 states had left the Union. You think it was tough for Biden or Trump or Bush or whoever you think of today, or LBJ or JFK. Or FDR, no doubt about it, they all had their challenges, but no one had a bigger challenge than Lincoln, especially a guy that's never been governor, that most people in the South hated because he was talking about freedom for all.
Amazing. Well, today we're recording this on MLK Day here today, who MLK is one of my biggest heroes. I think that Frederick Douglass is absolutely one of the greatest American figures. I just am really a fan. How much do you think Frederick Douglass inspired Martin Luther King?
I think, I can't do the definitive biography on MLK, but I think in every way. I mean, the one thing about William Lloyd Garrison spotted when he came up and spoke one time, William Lloyd Garrison had an abolitionist group and he had an abolition newspaper. And he said, I got to have you speak for me. He spoke one time. And William Lloyd Garrison was nonviolent. Whatever you do not get violent, even if people get violent to you. Gerrit Smith was somebody that became his mentor later and said, at times you got to stand up for yourself. And Frederick Douglass, for the most part, as you know, John, because you read the book, at 17 years old, he was almost beaten to death. And it looks like he had heat stroke. He escaped to his original owner that leased him out and said, I'm getting beaten and abused. The guy said, you got to go back anyway. When he goes back, the guy confronts him and tried to whip him, and he fought back, which is grounds for death. But this guy was known as a slave breaker, and he had this reputation. So when this 17-year-old was probably built out of solid muscle because he'd been working his whole life, fought back defensively, and then after 2 hours, according to his biography, wins the fight. The guy walks away, never confronted him again because he couldn't let it out that he gets beaten. Douglas said, I learned from the rest of my life, I will never take one backward step. So, but yet he wouldn't be an offensive person. He would physically stand up for himself in the Baltimore shipyards and in the Massachusetts shipyards. And when he was attacked on stage, William Lloyd Garrison was very much like MLK, but he's a white guy, abolitionist. He started a newspaper called The Liberator, which Douglas wrote for. Douglas would start his own newspaper, and he would constantly be physically challenged. But I think that if MLK doesn't take anything from Frederick Douglass, he'd be crazy because he was the first. Douglas was so well educated, people doubted his story. They said, there's no way this guy was born a slave, but he was such a smart guy. He was able to just engender all these thoughts, never stop reading the Bible and the classics, this thing called the Columbian Orator, and found out what Socrates thought and Plato thought and Aristotle thought and what George Washington thought. All these Napoleon, all these great leaders, Napoleon came after, excuse me, but all these great leaders thought. And so when Frederick Douglass lives his life, he never stops learning. Then he fought for women's rights and the women's rights to vote. So for MLK not to be influenced would be crazy. I know that Booker T. Washington certainly was, and Booker T. led to MLK. And there was Malcolm X, who was much more aggressive. But to me, Frederick Douglass reminded me of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and Martin Luther King. He was kind of a mix of sarcasm, of humor, and directness and deep thought.
The intelligence is just absolutely awesome. You can see it in the book. I know you've got to go because you have other interviews. Man, I love this. I'm encouraged that our country has come so far. We still have a long way to go, but I think that you're gonna get both of those things in this book. So Cooper Sub fans, go out, check out the book. It is called The President and the Freedom Fighter. Can't thank you enough for coming on. It's a real treat, and I will be talking to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it. I look forward to your new album.
Thank you, brother.